In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where the ancient trees stand tall and the wind carries whispers from the past, lies a world of mystery and dread. For centuries, the Cherokee people have lived in harmony with the land, deeply aware of the spirits that dwell in the forest. These spirits are not always benevolent. Some protect, some watch, and others wait in the shadows, feeding off the fear of those who dare to disturb the balance of nature. This is not just a place of beauty, it is a place of power, where the line between the living and the dead blurs, and the unseen forces of the earth roam freely. The Cherokee elders tell stories of warnings, of horrors, of creatures and spirits that punish those who do not heed the old ways. Few who encounter these beings live to tell the tale. These are the stories of the horrors that dwell in the forest, where darkness thrives and the spirits of the land reign supreme. Turn back if you value your peace of mind, for once you step into the world of the Cherokee forest, you may never return the same. Let us begin. Story 1: The Spirit of the Raven Mocker. The night was cold and still, with only the faintest rustling of leaves disturbed by the occasional gust of wind that swept through the dark Appalachian woods. The Cherokee village lay quiet beneath the star-strewn sky, except for one small cabin at the edge of the forest where an old man lay dying. Inside, his family sat in silence, mourning what they knew to be his final hours. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and a heavy sense of dread filled the room. The dying man, Sali, had lived a long life, filled with honor and wisdom. But as death approached, something more than the natural process of life seemed to take hold. Strange occurrences had begun in the past few nights. Unexplained footsteps outside the cabin, a distant sound like the flapping of wings, and the haunting cawing of ravens in the dead of night. These signs pointed to something far worse than mere death: the presence of the Raven Mocker, or Kalanu Akieliski, a dreaded spirit known in Cherokee lore to steal the life force of the dying. The Raven Mocker was feared for its ability to extend its own life by devouring the remaining years of those on the brink of death. Wherever it appeared, it brought a cold wind and an eerie silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of its wings and the cawing of ravens. It could not be seen by ordinary eyes except those of a shaman, and it could not be fought with ordinary weapons. To face the Raven Mocker was to face death itself. As Sali's breath grew shallow and his family sat vigil, a sudden gust of wind rattled the shutters of the cabin. The fire flickered, and for a brief moment, the room was plunged into near darkness. Sali's eldest son, Nokwisi, stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard the stories all his life, but had never believed he would come face to face with the creature of legend. The old shaman, who had visited the cabin earlier that day, had warned the family that the Raven Mocker would come. He had given Nokwisi a small pouch of sacred herbs, telling him to spread them around the house to ward off evil spirits. But was it enough? Outside, the wind howled louder, and the cawing of ravens filled the night air, echoing through the trees. Nokwisi knew the creature was close. He glanced at his mother and younger siblings, who huddled together by the fire, their faces pale with fear. Without a word, Nokwisi grabbed his hunting knife and stepped outside. The night was darker than he expected, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The forest loomed around the cabin, its trees like twisted sentinels, watching in silence. The air was unnaturally cold, and with each step Nokwisi took, he felt a sense of foreboding growing stronger. He had no idea how to fight a creature like the Raven Mocker, but he would not let it take his father's life without a struggle. He followed the sound of the ravens, their cawing growing louder as he ventured deeper into the woods. His breath came in short, visible puffs in the cold air, and his heart pounded in his chest. Suddenly the cawing stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press down on him. Nokwisi stopped in his tracks, scanning the trees around him. He could feel something watching him, but he couldn't see it. Then from the corner of his eye he saw a shadow move, a dark, twisted figure standing just at the edge of the clearing, cloaked in darkness. Its form was not fully human, nor fully animal. It had the shape of a man, but its eyes gleamed with a cold predatory light, and from its back stretched the black wings of a raven, the Raven Mocker. Nokwisi gripped his knife tighter, but he knew it would be useless against such a creature. The raven mocker let out a low, guttural laugh, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. It stepped forward, its eyes locked on Nokwisi's. "You cannot stop me," it whispered, its voice carrying on the wind. "Your father's life is mine." Desperation flooded through Nokwisi. He had to think fast. Remembering the shaman's words, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the pouch of herbs. He scattered them in a wide circle around him, hoping that the sacred herbs would offer some protection. The raven mocker hesitated, its eyes narrowing as it watched the herbs fall to the ground. But then it smiled, a chilling, predatory grin. "Foolish boy," it said. "You think that will stop me?" Before Nokwisi could react, the raven mocker leaped into the air, its wings spreading wide as it soared toward the cabin. Nokwisi cried out in panic, racing after it. He could hear the cawing of ravens all around him, their mocking cries filling the night air. The creature was fast, too fast for him to catch, but he couldn't stop. He had to protect his family. As Nokwisi reached the edge of the forest, he saw the raven mocker hovering above the cabin, its wings casting long shadows over the roof. The creature raised its hands, and a gust of wind tore through the clearing, blowing open the cabin door. Nokwisi watched in horror as his family was engulfed in darkness. The fire inside flickered and died. Summoning every ounce of courage, Nokwisi shouted an ancient Cherokee prayer, calling upon the spirits of the land to aid him. The wind howled in response, and for a brief moment the raven mocker hesitated. It turned its glowing eyes toward Nokwisi, its face twisted with fury. "You cannot defy me," it screeched. But as it moved toward him, something incredible happened. A powerful light burst from the forest, enveloping the cabin in a warm, golden glow. The trees seemed to come alive, their branches reaching out like arms, surrounding the raven mocker. The creature screamed in agony as the spirits of the forest took hold of it, dragging it away into the shadows. Nokwisi fell to his knees, exhausted, as the wind died down and the raven's cawing faded into the distance. When he entered the cabin, he found his father still alive, his breathing shallow but steady. The family gathered around, offering prayers of thanks to the spirits that had saved them from the raven mocker's grasp, but Nokwisi knew deep down that the creature was not gone forever. The raven mocker would return, as it always did, hunting for the dying, lurking in the shadows of the ancient forest. Story 2. The Bone Eater's Lament. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dense, misty forest as a group of 5 Cherokee hunters made their way deeper into the wilderness. Their hunt had not gone well. For days, the forest had seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife absent, and the game they sought elusive. Determined to return to the village with food, they had ventured farther than they ever had before, into a part of the woods whispered about in fearful tones by the elders, the domain of the Utlunta, the Bone Eater. The Bone Eater was a creature of legend, an unspeakable terror said to roam the darkest parts of the forest. It was a spirit, some said, or a cursed being that had once been human, but had transformed into a grotesque monster. It fed not on flesh, but on the bones of the living and the dead. Its hunger insatiable, its presence marked by strange, skeletal remains, and the haunting cry of something neither fully human nor fully beast. The hunters had heard the stories growing up, warnings to never venture too deep into the woods, where the Bone Eater's lair was said to lie, but hunger had driven them beyond caution, and now they found themselves in a part of the forest they did not recognize. The trees were taller here, their trunks twisted and gnarled as though shaped by some ancient malevolent force. The ground was littered with bones, some of animals, but others unmistakably human. "We should turn back," one of the younger hunters, Yona, said, his voice trembling. He knelt to examine a set of bones half buried in the leaves. "This place, it isn't right." The leader of the group, Galilahi, shook his head. "We can't go back empty-handed," he said, though there was unease in his voice. "We need to find something, anything. We'll leave as soon as we have enough meat for the village." But the deeper they ventured, the stranger the forest became. The mist grew thicker, swirling around them, and the air seemed colder, biting through their skins. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally in the silence, as if the forest were listening, waiting. Every now and then a distant cry could be heard, faint but unsettling. It sounded almost like a human wail, though distorted, as though coming from something not entirely human. Hours passed and the hunters found nothing. No tracks, no signs of animals, only more bones, scattered in unnatural patterns. Galalahi stopped, frowning. "Something is wrong," he muttered, his eyes scanning the trees. The mist had grown so thick they could barely see a few feet ahead. Just as he was about to call for them to turn back, a sharp crack echoed through the forest. One of the hunters, Tyanita, let out a gasp, pointing toward a nearby tree. At its base was a massive skeletal figure, its arms long and thin, its face a twisted mask of bone and decayed flesh. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, glowed with a faint, sickly light. This was no ordinary creature. This was the Utlunta. The bone-eater rose slowly, its joints creaking and popping as it stood to its full height. It was taller than any man, its limbs impossibly long, its mouth a gaping maw filled with jagged bone-like teeth. It let out a low guttural growl, and the air around them grew colder still. The hunters froze in place, too terrified to move. Galalahi reached for his bow, but his hand shook so badly he could barely hold it. The bone-eater stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its gaze locked on them. The hunters backed away, their hearts pounding in their chests. "We have to run," Yona whispered, his voice barely audible. But there was no escape. The forest itself seemed to close in around them, the mist thickening, the trees looming like dark sentinels. The bone-eater let out a bone-chilling screech, a sound that pierced the very air and sent the hunters scattering in panic. Yona was the first to fall. As he ran, he tripped over a root and crashed to the ground. Before he could get back to his feet, the bone-eater was upon him, its long skeletal fingers wrapped around his throat, and with a sickening crunch it twisted his head, breaking his neck. The creature crouched over his body, its mouth opening impossibly wide as it began to devour his bones, the sound of snapping and grinding echoing through the trees. The remaining hunters ran as fast as they could, but the mist was disorienting, and the forest seemed to shift around them. Tyanita screamed as she was pulled into the darkness by something unseen. Galalahi turned in time to see her disappear, her cries abruptly silenced. Desperation clawed at him. He had to escape. He had to warn the village. But as he stumbled through the forest, the bone-eater's haunting wail echoed behind him, growing louder with each step. His legs burned with exhaustion, but he didn't dare stop. Every now and then he would catch a glimpse of the creature in the mist, moving with unnatural speed, its bony frame darting between the trees. At last, Galalahi reached a clearing, gasping for breath. But as he looked around, he realized with horror that the clearing was littered with bones, hundreds of them, all arranged in a strange, spiraling pattern. This was the bone-eater's lair. A shadow fell over him, and Galalahi slowly turned. The bone-eater stood at the edge of the clearing, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. There was nowhere to run. Galalahi closed his eyes, whispering a prayer to the spirits as the creature advanced. The last sound he heard was the snapping of his own bones. Story 3. The Howling of the Uktena. The dense forest stretched endlessly into the horizon, its vast expanse untouched by man, save for the occasional footprint of a curious hunter or brave traveler. But for the Cherokee, there was a place deep within the woods where no one dared to go, a forbidden mountain said to be the dwelling of an ancient and terrible creature, the Uktena. This monstrous horned serpent, with its glowing eyes and deadly gaze, was said to possess unimaginable power. The stories of its wrath and its ability to bring ruin upon anyone who sought its lair had been passed down through generations. The mountain was cursed, and the Uktena was its eternal guardian. Despite the warnings, a group of young men from the village grew restless. Their leader, a bold and reckless youth named Atsadi, believed the Uktena was nothing more than an old tale meant to scare children. He had heard from an elder that the creature guarded a stone of great power, a Ulansuti, which could grant its possessor visions of the future and immense strength. With the arrogance of youth and the desire for glory, Atsadi convinced three others, Waya, Dohi, and Onakona, to join him on a journey to the Forbidden Mountain. Their mission, to kill the Uktena and claim the Ulunsuti for themselves. The morning they set out, the sky was clear, but there was an unnatural stillness in the air. The birds, which usually sang joyfully from the treetops, were silent, and the forest seemed to hold its breath as the four young men made their way through the underbrush. Atsadi led the way, his bow slung over his shoulder and a confident grin on his face. Waya, his closest friend, followed close behind, while Dohi and Onakona brought up the rear, exchanging uneasy glances. They had all heard the stories about the Uktena, and though they had laughed them off back in the village, something about the oppressive silence of the forest made their laughter seem far away. As they traveled deeper into the wilderness, the trees began to change. The bark on the trunks turned darker, almost black, and the leaves seemed to shimmer with an unnatural hue. Strange symbols carved into the trees by ancient hands marked the path ahead, symbols that Atsadi, in his arrogance, dismissed as mere superstition. But the others began to grow more fearful, sensing the weight of something far more ancient than they could understand. The first sign that something was wrong came when they reached a wide river that cut through the forest. The water, which should have been clear and fast-moving, was thick and still, as though it had turned to oil. Dead fish floated on the surface, their pale bellies bloated and lifeless. Atsadi frowned but said nothing, leading the group across the river on a narrow, rotting log. On the other side, the forest grew darker still, and a cold wind began to blow from the direction of the mountain. As they continued their journey, a low, distant howl echoed through the trees. At first, it was faint, like the wind passing through the branches, but as they drew closer to the mountain, the howling grew louder, more distinct. It was not the sound of a wolf or any other animal they had ever heard before. It was something far more sinister, a wailing that seemed to come from the very earth itself, a mournful cry that sent shivers down their spines. "What is that?" Dohi whispered, glancing nervously at the others. "Nothing," Atsadi replied, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "It's just the wind." But the others were not convinced. They could feel it now, the weight of something watching them, following them as they made their way up the mountain slope. The trees thinned as they climbed, replaced by jagged rocks and twisted shrubs. The howling grew louder, reverberating off the stone walls of the mountain, and the air grew colder with each step. By the time they reached the base of the mountain's peak, the sun had disappeared behind thick, swirling clouds. A heavy fog rolled in, blanketing the ground in a thick, soupy mist that clung to their skin and made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Atsadi slowed his pace, his confidence eroding with each passing moment. The howling had grown so loud now that it seemed to come from all directions, an unholy sound that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. They reached a plateau, a wide, flat expanse of rock where the fog swirled in thick, ghostly tendrils. In the center of the plateau stood an enormous boulder, its surface covered in strange, glowing runes. Atsadi stared at it, his heart racing. This had to be it, the entrance to the Uktena's lair. He gestured for the others to follow him as he approached the boulder, but as they drew near, the ground began to tremble. The howling stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the mountain. The fog swirled violently, and from the darkness, a massive, serpentine shape began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, a silhouette too large to comprehend, but as the creature slithered into view, its full horror became clear. The Uktena was unlike anything they had ever imagined. Its body was as thick as the trunk of an ancient tree, covered in iridescent scales that shimmered with an unholy light. Its eyes glowed red, piercing through the fog like twin beacons of death. A long, spiraling horn jutted from its forehead, and its mouth, lined with razor-sharp teeth, dripped with venom. The creature's gaze fell upon the intruders, and in that moment, the young men knew that the stories had been true. The Uktena was real, and they had made a terrible mistake in coming here. Atsadi was the first to react, drawing his bow and firing an arrow at the serpent's massive form. The arrow flew true, striking the Uktena in the side, but it bounced off the creature's scales as though it had hit solid stone. The Uktana reared back, letting out a deafening roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet. It lunged forward with terrifying speed, its massive body coiling around the plateau like a living hurricane. Waya screamed as the serpent's tail whipped toward him, knocking him off his feet and sending him sprawling to the ground. Doe and Anakona drew their weapons, but they were no match for the Uktana. The creature's movements were too fast, too powerful. It struck with the force of a landslide, its coils wrapping around Anakona, crushing him with ease. His bones snapped like twigs, his body disappearing into the mist as the Uktana devoured him whole. Dohe turned to run, but the serpent's glowing eyes locked onto him. He froze, his body paralyzed by the creature's gaze. The Uktana let out a low, guttural hiss, and in an instant, Dohe was consumed by fire. His screams echoed through the fog as his body crumbled to ash, the serpent's venomous breath burning him alive. Atsadi stood alone now, his heart pounding in his chest. The Uktana's eyes fixed on him, its massive form looming above him like a mountain of scales and death. In that moment, Atsadi knew that there was no escape. He had led his friends to their deaths, and now the Uktana would claim him as well. Desperate, Atsadi reached for the sacred stone, the Ulansuti, which lay nestled among the runes on the boulder. His fingers brushed against it, and for a brief moment he felt a surge of power course through him. But it was too late. The Uktana lunged, its jaws wide, and Atsadi's world went dark as the serpent swallowed him whole. The howling of the Uktana echoed across the mountain once more, and the fog swallowed the plateau. The serpent slithered back into the depths of the mountain, its hunger momentarily sated. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the last echoes of the young men's screams. Back in the village, the elders sat in silence, their faces grim. They knew that the mountain would claim more lives, as it always had. The Uktana was eternal, and its lair would remain untouched for as long as the forest stood. Those who sought its power would never return, lost forever in the mist and the shadows of the cursed mountain. Story 4. The Skinwalker's Curse. The sun had set behind the Appalachian Mountains, and the dense Cherokee village was quiet, with only the faintest sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The villagers went about their evening routines, tending to the fire, preparing meals, and sharing stories of the day's work. However, beneath the surface of this ordinary evening, whispers circulated among the elders, whispers of a strange visitor who had returned to the village after years of isolation. Her name was Ayana, and she had left the village when she was only a young woman, seeking solitude in the deep wilderness. No one knew why she left. Some said it was grief. Others claimed she had been called away by a shaman's vision. Whatever the reason, she had disappeared without a trace, and many believed she had perished in the unforgiving wilderness. Yet here she was, standing at the edge of the village, her form cloaked in the fading light of dusk, her eyes catching the glow of the fire as though they reflected something otherworldly. She was greeted cautiously, with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Her hair was longer now, streaked with silver, and her face bore the weathered lines of someone who had lived through hardships unknown to the villagers. But something about her was off. The animals sensed it first. The dogs, which usually wandered the village freely, kept their distance, their tails tucked low as they whimpered in her presence. Even the birds in the trees seemed to fall silent as Ayana walked past. Though the villagers were happy to see her alive, an unspoken fear lingered in the air. Ayana's eyes, once warm and kind, now gleamed with a strange intensity in the firelight. Her movements were fluid but deliberate, almost as though she were not entirely human anymore. And there was something else, something unsettling that no one could quite place. The way her presence seemed to make the air colder, or how shadows seemed to cling to her longer than they should. It wasn't long before the elders began to whisper about the old stories, stories of those who walked between worlds, of those who had given themselves over to dark spirits. They spoke of the Yunwitsunsdi, the little people who could lead a person astray or worse, transform them. But it was another, more terrifying legend that soon became the subject of their hushed conversations. The Skinwalker. A skinwalker, according to Cherokee lore, was a witch who could transform into any animal by wearing its skin. These beings were powerful and feared, known to walk between the physical and spirit worlds, using their abilities to curse others and take on the forms of beasts for malevolent purposes. While the skinwalkers were often spoken of in hushed tones, their presence was rare and always associated with death, misfortune, and unspeakable horrors. At first, the villagers dismissed such talk as mere superstition. After all, Ayanna was one of them, born and raised in the village. But soon, strange events began to unfold, and the whispers turned into full-blown fear. It started with the livestock. Sheep, goats, and chickens were found slaughtered in the night, their bodies torn apart by something with teeth far larger than any wolf or coyote. The villagers tried to hunt whatever beast was responsible, but no tracks could be found. The only sound on those nights was the howling of wolves, louder and more frequent than ever before. One evening, a villager named Askuato was walking near the edge of the forest when he heard rustling in the trees. He paused, his heart racing as he listened. At first, he thought it was an animal, a deer perhaps, or a rabbit, but then he saw it. At the edge of the clearing stood a massive, dark shape, larger than any wolf he had ever seen. Its fur was thick and black, and its eyes gleamed like hot coals in the darkness. Askuato froze, gripping his bow tightly. He was a skilled hunter, but something about this creature felt wrong. It moved with a strange, unnatural grace, as though it were not quite of this world. The wolf stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Its eyes locked on his, and then, without a sound, it vanished into the shadows. Terrified, Askuato ran back to the village and told the elders what he had seen. They listened carefully, their expressions grim, and one by one, their eyes turned toward Ayanna's cabin, where she had been living alone since her return. No one had seen her that evening, but they all knew the stories. Stories of witches who could take on the forms of animals, particularly wolves, and stalk the night in search of prey. The next day, the village awoke to find the body of a young man named Atsadi, a hunter, lying near the edge of the forest. His throat had been torn out, and his body was covered in deep claw marks. The elders gathered, their faces ashen with fear. This was no ordinary animal attack. Something far more sinister was at work. As rumors spread, the villagers became more fearful of Ayanna. She was often seen wandering the forest late at night, alone, and some claimed to have seen her conversing with the animals, as though they understood her. Her eyes, they said, glowed unnaturally in the moonlight, and when she spoke, her voice had a strange, guttural quality, like the low growl of a wolf. It wasn't long before the villagers began to avoid her altogether. They whispered behind her back, exchanging fearful glances whenever she passed by. But Ayanna seemed unfazed by their fear. She moved through the village with an eerie calm, as though she were no longer a part of it, as though she had crossed over into something else. One night, a group of brave villagers, led by Askuato, decided to confront Ayanna. They gathered outside her cabin, carrying torches and weapons, their faces set with determination. They knocked on the door, calling her name, but there was no answer. After a long silence, Askuato pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was dark and the air was thick with an oppressive stillness. The fire had long since burned out, and the only light came from the flickering torches outside. Askuato moved cautiously through the small room, his heart pounding in his chest. He called out Ayanna's name again, but the only response was the soft rustling of something in the shadows. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, Ayanna, her face half hidden in the shadows. Her eyes gleamed in the dim light, and her mouth curled into a strange, almost predatory smile. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low and cold. Askuato took a step back, his hands shaking. "We want to know what you've done," he said, his voice trembling. "The animals, the wolves, the deaths. What are you?" Ayanna's smile faded, and for a moment her face twisted with something darker, something inhuman. "You should not have come here," she whispered. "There are things you do not understand, things you cannot hope to understand." Before Askuato could react, Ayanna's body began to change. Her limbs elongated, her skin rippling and contorting as her form shifted before their eyes. Her fingers became claws, her teeth sharpened into fangs, and her eyes glowed with the feral light of a predator. In a matter of moments, she had transformed into a massive black wolf, far larger than any normal animal, with fur as dark as midnight and eyes that burned with a malevolent fire. The villagers screamed and stumbled backward, dropping their torches as they fled. Askuato stood frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The wolf, Ayana, let out a low growl, baring its teeth as it stalked toward him. He knew then that the stories were true. Ayana was a skinwalker, cursed to walk between worlds, no longer fully human but not entirely beast. With a snarl, the wolf lunged at him, and Askuato barely managed to throw himself out of the way. He scrambled to his feet and ran, the sound of the wolf's heavy paws thundering behind him. He could hear its breath, hot and ragged, as it closed in on him, but he didn't dare look back. He ran through the village, shouting for help, but no one dared to leave their homes. The doors were bolted shut, the windows dark. The howling of wolves filled the night air, and Askuato knew that he was running out of time. Finally, he reached the edge of the forest, and for a brief moment he thought he had escaped. But then he heard it, the soft padding of paws behind him. He turned, and there she was, the wolf, standing just a few feet away, her eyes glowing with a cold, predatory hunger. Askuato backed away, his heart racing, but there was nowhere to run. The wolf took a step forward, her lips curling into a snarl. And then, with a swift, deadly motion, she lunged. The last thing Askuato saw was the gleam of her teeth in the moonlight, and then there was only darkness. In the days that followed, the village fell silent. The bodies of the men who had gone to confront Ayana were found at the edge of the forest, their throats torn out, their bodies mauled beyond recognition. The villagers knew then that Ayana was no longer one of them. She had become something else, something far more dangerous. And so the village returned to its quiet, fearful existence. They no longer spoke of Ayana, and no one dared venture into the forest at night. But the howling of the wolves continued, louder and more frequent than ever before, a constant reminder that the skinwalker still roamed the woods, her curse eternal, her hunger unquenchable. Those who saw her true form were doomed, and the villagers knew that she would never stop hunting. Not until the last of them had fallen to the skinwalker's curse. Story 5. The Watchers in the Trees. The dense canopy of the Appalachian forest stretched out as far as the eye could see, the trees standing tall and ancient, their roots winding deep into the earth. The Cherokee people had always known that the forest was alive, not just with animals but with spirits, the Nunahi, the Watchers in the trees. These spirit beings were protectors of the land, invisible to most but ever present, watching over the sacred groves, the rivers, and the mountains. They were known to be benevolent if left undisturbed, but if provoked, their wrath was swift and terrible. Despite the warnings passed down through generations, the world was changing. White settlers were encroaching on Cherokee lands, cutting down trees and building their homes where none should be. Greedy for the wealth of the land, they had little respect for the sacred places that had been protected for centuries, and when a group of loggers arrived at the edge of the forest, armed with axes and saws, they ignored the old stories told by the Cherokee elders, brushing them off as mere superstition. Tom Caldwell, the leader of the logging crew, stood at the edge of the forest, his sharp blue eyes scanning the towering trees before him. These trees, he had heard, were some of the oldest in the region, massive oaks and pines, their trunks wide enough that it would take several men to wrap their arms around them. He could almost feel the wealth they represented. His men were eager, their tools gleaming in the early morning light, ready to fell the giants of the forest. But what Tom didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that these trees were more than just wood. They were home to ancient spirits, guardians who had protected the land for centuries. The Cherokee elder, a man named Etsy, had come to warn them one last time, standing at the edge of their camp with a grim expression. His long gray hair and wrinkled face gave him the air of someone who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. "You must not go into those woods," he had told Tom in a low, serious voice. "The Nunahi are watching. If you disturb their home, you will bring ruin upon yourselves." Tom had laughed, dismissing the old man with a wave of his hand. "I've heard your stories," he said, his voice tinged with condescension. "Spirits in the trees, protectors of the land. It's all nonsense. We've got a job to do. These trees are coming down whether you like it or not." The elder had said nothing more, only turned and walked away, but not before casting one last look at the forest, a look of sorrow, of fear. His words, though ignored, lingered in the minds of some of the loggers. They had heard tales from their own grandparents, stories about strange disappearances, about men going into the forest and never returning. But the promise of money drowned out their hesitation, and as the sun rose higher in the sky, they picked up their axes and saws and entered the forest. The first tree to fall was a towering oak, its bark rough and weathered, its branches high and wide. Tom swung his axe with a practiced motion, the sharp blade biting into the wood with a satisfying thunk. The other men followed suit, their laughter echoing through the forest as chips of wood flew into the air. For hours, they worked, the sound of axes and saws cutting through the eerie silence of the forest. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, strange things began to happen. It started subtly. The air, which had been warm and thick with the smell of pine and earth, grew cold, unnaturally cold, as though winter had descended without warning. The wind, which had been gentle and rustling through the leaves, died down completely, leaving an oppressive stillness that made the men uneasy. The laughter faded, replaced by tense silence, and more than one of the loggers found themselves glancing over their shoulders, feeling as though they were being watched. Then the whispers began. At first it was so faint that the men thought it was their imagination, just the wind moving through the branches, or the distant calls of birds. But as they paused in their work, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were not words anyone could understand, but the tone was unmistakable, low, angry, and accusing. The trees, it seemed, were speaking. Tom, irritated by the growing fear among his men, barked at them to get back to work. "It's nothing," he snapped. "Just the wind, or maybe the local wildlife. There's no such thing as spirits, and you're all acting like children." But even as he spoke, a chill ran down his spine. There was something about the forest that felt wrong, as though the very trees were watching him, their ancient eyes peering down from the branches, unseen but ever present. He shook off the feeling and raised his axe again, determined to finish the job. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until it felt as though they were coming from all around, from the trees themselves, from the ground beneath their feet. The first sign of true danger came when one of the younger loggers, a man named Ben, let out a scream. He had been standing near the edge of the clearing, sharpening his saw, when the ground beneath him seemed to shift. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror, and pointed toward the trees. "Did you see that?" he gasped. "Something's out there!" The men turned, their hearts pounding, but all they saw were the trees, tall, silent, and unmoving. "There's nothing there," Tom said, though his voice wavered slightly. But Ben shook his head, his face pale. "No, I saw something. It was moving. Something in the trees, watching us." The other men exchanged uneasy glances, and though no one else had seen it, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was indeed watching them. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and move, as though something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. As night fell, the fear among the men grew. They built a fire in the center of the clearing, hoping that the light would chase away whatever was out there. But the fire only seemed to make the shadows deeper, the whispers louder. The trees loomed above them, their branches swaying gently in the night air, though there was no wind to move them. Suddenly there was a loud cracking sound like the snapping of a tree branch, and one of the men, Charlie, was yanked into the darkness. His scream echoed through the forest, sharp and terrified, but it was cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of the crackling fire and the now frantic whispers of the trees. The men jumped to their feet, panic spreading through the camp like wildfire. "What the hell was that?" one of them shouted, his eyes wide with fear. "Where's Charlie?" Tom grabbed his axe, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to find him," he said, though his voice was laced with fear. But as they moved toward the spot where Charlie had been standing, something stopped them. The trees, which had seemed so still and solid, were moving, their branches twisted and writhed like living creatures, their roots snaking across the ground as though searching for something, or someone. Then the whispers turned into voices, clear and cold, with an edge of anger. "You have taken from us," the voices said, though none of the men could tell where the sound was coming from. "Now we take from you." Before anyone could react, another scream pierced the night, followed by the sound of something being dragged through the underbrush. One by one, the loggers were picked off, disappearing into the darkness, their screams lost in the cacophony of whispers and rustling leaves. The fire flickered and sputtered as if the very air had grown too cold for it to survive. Tom, now alone, ran through the forest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His axe felt heavy in his hand, but he knew it would be useless against whatever was hunting him. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like fingers brushing against his skin, pulling at his clothes. He could hear the voices all around him, accusing him, condemning him. "You were warned," they said, "but you did not listen." Tom stumbled over a root and fell to the ground, his heart racing. He tried to stand, but something held him down, a cold, invisible force that pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. The trees loomed above him, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes, their roots curling around his ankles like serpents. In the distance, he could see the faint glow of the village lights, but they were too far away. The forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed his men. The whispers grew louder, filling his ears, drowning out his thoughts. The last thing he saw was the shadowy form of the Nunnehi emerging from the trees, their eyes glowing with an ancient, terrible light. And then, there was only darkness. In the days that followed, the Cherokee village remained quiet. The loggers never returned, and the forest stood as it always had, silent and eternal. The elders knew what had happened. They had warned the outsiders, but the warnings had been ignored. The Nunnehi had protected their land as they always had, and would continue to do so for as long as the trees stood. No one dared to enter the forest after that. The villagers spoke of the watchers in the trees in hushed tones, and the old paths through the woods were abandoned. At night, the wind would carry the sound of whispers through the branches, reminding all who heard them that the forest was not to be disturbed and that the Nunnehi were always watching. And for those who had defied them, there was no return.